This set of lectures will be about the brain, the parts of the brain, and how we are going to break it down. So the brain. Let's talk about neural development to start with. We break it down into three basic pieces. 3 to 4 weeks, we have three regions of what will become the brain. We have the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the ramencephalon. Those quickly divide out at the 5-week mark. When we talk about where did something come from, we usually are using the 5-week markers. So all you really have to know about the prosencephalon is that it becomes the telencephalon and diencephalon. The mesencephalon does not divide. All you really have to know about the ramencephalon is it becomes the metencephalon and myelencephalon. So we have these regions: telencephalon, diencephalon, mesencephalon, metencephalon, and myelencephalon. And the mnemonic for that is not quite as catchy as the one for cranial nerves, but I use today, mes, met, myelo. And I realize that there's no real actual O in myelencephalon, but it helps me remember today, telencephalon, diencephalon, mes, met, myelo, mesencephalon, metencephalon, myelencephalon. And this is how they are organized from the most superior to the most inferior through the brain. The telencephalon then will develop into the cerebral hemispheres, all the lobes, as well as the corpus callosum. The diencephalon becomes the hypothalamus and the thalamus, and another structure called the epithalamus, which I'll go into. The mesencephalon becomes the midbrain and the colliculi. The metencephalon becomes the pons and the cerebellum, while the myelencephalon becomes the medulla oblongata. So this chart is right out of the lab book, but I redrew it with the colors to try and help you find it. So let's do a few definitions before we actually get into the parts of the brain, just so we have them when we talk about them. A gyrus is a fold in the brain. So if the brain does this fold thing, the folds are a single fold is a gyrus. The plural is we have multiple gyri. And the sulcus is the groove. So the sulcus would be the groove, the indentation. The plural there is sulci. So we talk about the gyri and the sulci of the brain. In the brain, we have something called a nucleus, which is not the same thing as the nucleus of a cell in the center of the cell. In the brain, it is a collection of neural cell bodies inside the central nervous system. Remember that when we did the peripheral nervous system, we had the word ganglion, and that meant a collection of neural cell bodies outside the CNS. This is now inside the central nervous system. And a tract in the brain is the collection of axons traveling through the brain. It's the equivalent of a nerve going through the peripheral nervous system. It's just staying inside the brain. So those are kind of our definitions that we're going to work from. This is a photograph of one of the brain's models from the lab, and we're going to look at the cerebral hemispheres, which create the lobes of the brain. Hemisphere means half of a sphere, and we have two, the right and the left hemispheres. And they create, they're separated into the 4 lobes of the brain that we're going to look at. So first, we have the frontal lobe, which is this region here, anterior. The frontal lobe functions include mathematics, your personality, problem solving, which kind of goes with the math, planning, and motor activities. Versus the parietal lobe is about sensory and sensory perception. That thing is heavy, that thing is cold, it has this shape for touch, and we have to figure out what that means. A lot of times I use the comparison of if I put something in your hand and when you felt it, the base sensation is that it is wet and it is cold and it is vaguely rectangular. Those are the base sensations: shape, temperature, kind of texture, but your brain puts that together to make it an ice cube. So you have to figure things out like that. The temporal lobe, which is this lower region here from this, the lateral fissure. And the temporal lobe is deep to the temporal bone. Here we process things like hearing and language, smell, taste, balance, reading. Language is more than just what words mean. Language is creating the words, creating sentence structure, assigning meaning, being able to recognize the symbols of words. So you might read with your eyes, but it's your temporal lobe that figures out what it means. So all of that goes into the temporal lobe. And finally, the occipital lobe is the visual cortex. This is where you not only see the base colors or shapes, but you also interpret what you are seeing. So that is the 4 lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. Some of the features of the cerebral hemisphere are that we have certain couple gyrus are named, and one of the ones that's named, it's called the central sulcus. So the central sulcus separates the frontal from the parietal lobe. So this would be frontal here and parietal on this side. Okay, it's that separation. Well, the gyrus that is anterior to the central sulcus is called the precentral gyrus. It is the primary motor cortex, meaning all your voluntary motor comes from this region. It's sort of mapped. There's a great picture in your textbook called a homunculus that maps how many nerves go to each region. We can abbreviate primary motor cortex to 1' SE cortex. On the posterior side of the central sulcus, we have the post-central gyrus, which is the primary sensory cortex. You might see somatosensory cortex. So it is the primary SA. And again, it's mapped so that fingertips have a larger representation than, say, your back because of the amount of sensitivity. The other feature that we really need to look at is the lateral fissure. This is what actually separates the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. There is no such structure that clearly defines where the occipital lobe ends.